My name is Archer Durham. I go by the nickname of Arch. The date of birth is 9 June 1932.
And where were you born?
Pasadena, California.
In a hospital?
No, I was born in the home that I grew up in on Wilson Avenue in so-called Bungalow Haven here in Pasadena.
Right. On
9th of June 1932. Migrated to Pasadena in the early 1920s, somewhere between 1921 1922. My father came from Woodstock, Georgia, and my mother came from Boley, Oklahoma. At different times, they didn't know each other. They met here in Southern California. My father was a porter on the railroad that serviced Pasadena and Los Angeles, and he used to make the run between Pasadena, Los Angeles, and Chicago, and he did that. This was before he met my mother, for about 2 or 3 years, and my mother was a domestic here in California, actually starting off in San Diego, and then she moved here to Pasadena and worked for a family here in Pasadena, and they met in Pasadena around 1923. I have one brother and deceased, and an older sister. My sister Barbara, still living in California in Long Beach. My brother passed away in 1998, and also grew up here in Pasadena as I did. His name was Barney Durham Jr. My sister's name was Barbara Camille Durham. Well, I'm a product of the Pasadena school system. I started off at Longfellow Elementary School on Washington Boulevard. Finished there and went to John Marshall Junior High School on Hill. And then finished my last 2 years of high school at then Pasadena Junior College, where they had the so-called 644 plan, where you had the last 2 years of high school and the first 2 years of college on the same campus. And so I graduated in high school in 1950, and then went 2 years to Pasadena City College and graduated in 1952, and on the same campus where the current Pasadena City College is. The Pasadena Junior College was converted over to a city college, I think after I left for the Air Force, somewhere, I believe in the early 1950s.
But you were on the gymnastics team.
Beg your pardon?
Were you on the gymnastics team?
That's correct.
Yeah.
I was very successful. I won the national championship in 1952. Was Olympic year and the Olympic trials, but did not go to the Olympic Games because only the all-around, which means all 6 events, would be on the U.S. team, and I only competed in 2 events. And I won the vault, gold medal in the vault, and the silver medal in the pommel horse. Wow,
that's impressive. And did you continue gymnastics after you?
I did. That was in 1952, and in the January of 1953, I went to the United States Air Force.
And how long were you in the Air Force?
36 years.
Were you in any combat situations?
Indirectly. I was an airlifter, flying transport aircraft, an airlift aircraft, and I flew in and out of Southeast Asia and Vietnam, resupplying the troops over there during the whole duration of that war.
Wow.
But I flew several missions in and out of Da Nang and Trang and quite a few of the airfields over there.
When did you leave Pasadena as a place to live?
1953, when I entered the Air Force. And as I said, I was in 36 years. I did come back when I married my wife here, Sue Marie Harrison from Los Angeles. I married in 1956. But then we became an Air Force family, and the rest is history. I've been stationed all over the world and all over the United States, and retired from the United States Air Force in 1989.
Wow. Well, congratulations and thank you.
Thank you.
You have children?
I have 4 kids, all grown now. 2 boys, 2 girls. Deborah, my oldest, David, the oldest boy, Beverly, the youngest daughter, and Stephen, the youngest son.
And do any of them live in Pasadena currently? Or?
Interestingly enough, my youngest daughter, Beverly, is living in Pasadena. She lives on Hudson Avenue, which is amazingly only about 4 blocks from where I was born.
Wow.
But she lives there now, and she went to college out here. She went to Cal State Dominguez Hills in Carson, was a communication major, and she's now a professional photographer and doing quite well.
How would you define community in terms of your life growing up? How would you say that you found community with your family? And
well, community. I would think that community is a group of people who have a common goal, common goals, common vision, not necessarily one particular category of people. They could be different ethnic groups, but there is a common denominator that brings them together where they share some type of common objective and common goal. And of course, what we're discussing here today is the African American family in Pasadena, and there certainly was a African American community here in Pasadena, albeit relatively small, but still it was here, and I was a part of that community. And it, in my judgment, was part and parcel of the growth of this city and played a major contribution in the success of the city of Pasadena.
do you think that that was recognized and honored as it was happening?
It was a slow process to be recognized as it was happening. If you overlay it over the so-called social revolution or civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, the African American community in Pasadena paralleled that and supported that and was part and parcel of that. So in that context it was recognized, but it was slow. But there were indicators even when I was here before I left for the Air Force. My mother belonged to an quote-unquote interracial club in the late 1940s and early 1950s, which might seem insignificant today, but it was a big deal at that time frame. But that was just an indicator of progress that was being made, where there wasn't a lot of social contact between the majority community and the African American community prior to the 40s and prior to World War II. And the whole civil rights era, and you cannot leave out World War II, because World War II is a major milestone and benchmark for progress in regard to African American progress in civil rights that opened the door for a lot of the things that happened during the so-called civil rights revolution. And I happened to be, fortunately, born in 1932. It was a very interesting time for me to be a part of that, even though I really didn't know what was going on, being a teenager during World War II. But I certainly was aware of circumstances, and my family kept me aware of what the circumstances were for African Americans here, even in Pasadena, the so-called unwritten do's and don'ts, and where you could live, where you couldn't, where you could eat, where you couldn't, where you could swim or where you couldn't, which is another story. The Brookside Plunge, whole issue of segregated swimming pools in Pasadena until 1947. And I was part of that in a very interesting, direct way, in that when that pool, the NAACP in Los Angeles filed suit against the city of Pasadena, won the suit after appeal, and it went to the Supreme Court of California to desegregate that pool. And when it did open, integrated in 1947, I did swim in it in 1947, not opening day, but during the summer of '47. And in a way, I was a part of that transition and experienced a part of it. And back to the original question, it was just, you know, one step forward, two steps back, all through that period of time, all into the current time right now, where we've made a lot of progress, but still perhaps a long ways to go. And if you drew a timeline right now while we're making this interview, we've got the Zimmerman case going, yes. So things are happening in regard to this subject, and it seems like it's a long journey.
Yeah. Would you say that the community you were a part of growing up, the most sort of central to your life, was mostly African American community, or was it other people of color, or was it a socioeconomic divide? Or
that's an interesting question, because I lived in what is now known as Bungalow Haven, which is over an area in Pasadena that's, I believe it's bordered by Lake and Hill and Washington and perhaps Orange Grove, which designates the architecture style of the homes in the area. And that was 99.9% white, and we were a small black enclave of maybe 8 to 10 families on the corner of Bell Street and Wilson that had integrated that community. Because it was a predominantly white area, I went to predominantly white schools. I was the only African American in many of my classes, from elementary school to junior high school, and did not have African American classmates until I got to Pasadena Junior College and high school, and of course in the college. More specific to the question, I was not involved in social activities in the white community through the schools when I grew up. Wasn't invited to parties or whatever, and most of my social activities were with church. I was a member of Friendship Baptist Church here in Pasadena, which is one of the historical black churches, not only in Pasadena, but perhaps in California, if not America. Been there for years, since the 20s. And I obviously had many social friends and contacts my age through the church. Also, I was in the Boy Scouts, and we had youth basketball and those kinds of things. And through my family, we obviously had African American friends that we socialized with. So I had kind of a dual world in regard to community, in regard to race in Pasadena as I grew up. But many white friends, perhaps more than I had African American friends, because I went to predominantly all white schools, and obviously many African American friends, so I had both.
Yeah, yeah. Do you feel, I know you don't live in Pasadena currently.
I live in Carson right now. Right? California, having been a state that was never legally segregated, but there's a hell of a lot of de facto segregation, really didn't have to deal with the issues that were confronted, obviously, in the segregated or deep South, the so-called Jim Crow South, and so forth. So perhaps didn't have as tough a path to travel as other African Americans did around the United States, especially in the South, but made their progress. But it seems to me, from what I've seen and the folks that I've talked to here since I've been back, they did quite well.
What did you do for fun growing up?
What did I do for fun growing up? Probably sports was probably my most enjoyable extracurricular activity, if you will. We didn't travel much. We were not a family of means, so we couldn't do a lot of traveling outside the state and so forth, although we did do a very interesting trip in 1949 all the way around the United States with my father, mother, and aunt. That was the first time I'd ever been out of the state and so forth. But back to the question. Sports. Played football, ran track, was a gymnast, and enjoyed that very much. Had hobbies, collecting everything, insect collections, bugs, you name it, that type of thing, and I enjoyed that. Just going around with my peers, friends, doing the things that teenagers and people growing up do.
What was it like being a teenager during World War II?
What was it like being a teenager? That was fascinating. There was just about 200 yards from our house on Wilson Avenue, there was a reservoir. And it was, at the time, it was called the Wilson Reservoir. Interesting enough, the same name as our street. It's now Brookside Park, and excuse me, not Brookside Park. I have to think about that. The name of the park. It's almost McDonald Park. Excuse me, McDonald Park. And that reservoir was almost a block square, and it served as a target for aircraft that were being built in Southern California to support the war. And I can remember during World War II, the P-38 aircraft that were built at the Lockheed plant in Burbank. Perhaps first flight, perhaps test flight before they were delivered to the Army Air Corps. They would dive and scrape and make mock scraping runs on that reservoir and come right over the top of my house, like maybe 50 feet when they were pulling up. And that was really a thrill for me, and quite frankly was probably the primary inspiration for me to want to become a pilot in the Air Force, which I did later years because of that experience. And of course there was the Tuskegee Airmen, which was the all-black unit, flying unit in Tuskegee, Alabama. That was also further inspiration because at the time when the war started, there were no black pilots. It was segregated, and the Tuskegee Airmen project was an experiment to see whether blacks knew how to fly airplanes or not, or were able to fly airplanes. And so all of that, in the context of World War II and me growing up in Pasadena, that was a major inspiration for me to be able to eventually join the United States Air Force and go to pilot training and become a pilot.
And you did that for 36 years?
Well, I didn't fly for 36 years, but I was in the Air Force for 36 years. I flew operationally my first 5 or 10 years, flying airlift and transport aircraft, and then went into staff jobs and ultimately into command. I was a 2-star general, and I was in charge of Andrews Air Force Base, 1980 to 1982. I also was the commander as a colonel before Andrews, the base commander at McGuire Air Force Base, the wing commander at Kirtland Air Force Base, New Mexico, and the wing commander at Dover Air Force Base, which is all C-5 base in Delaware. So I had quite a bit of command experience, and when I got promoted, I was primarily in staff. After I left Andrews, I was in a joint command, Army command, that was involved with transportation, the Military Traffic Management Command, and then went to Florida, MacDill, and was in the deployment business, managing the deployment of military forces, U.S. forces worldwide, before I retired.
And what was your experience personally in the Air Force? Was it the desegregation was complete, and it was?
Yes, it was. Positive. I think Harry Truman signed the executive order to desegregate the military. It was 47, I believe. And I came in 53, so it was well underway. And I can honestly say that I just never had any problems whatsoever during my 36 years in an integrated Air Force from the time that I came in. And that's not to say that there may not have been other isolated problems throughout that period of time in the military in general, or the Air Force specifically, but I didn't have any problems whatsoever, and was judged on merit, I would like to believe, and progressed accordingly.
Yeah. And you met your wife, you said, in Los Angeles?
Right. Well, actually, I met her in Pasadena because she had an aunt, a relative here, but she was living in Pasadena and grew up, living in Los Angeles. But I met her in Pasadena, and we married in 1956 after I'd been in the Air Force for 3 years. And we're married for 47 years, and she passed away, 10 years this month from cancer in 2003. And we were the proud parents of 4 beautiful children. I think it'd be an interesting note that after my oldest daughter and oldest son left high school, my oldest son came to Pasadena and went to Caltech for 4 years, 5 years actually, to Caltech. And my oldest daughter came out here to go to college, but she lived in Pasadena with my parents and then on her own. And eventually, to make a long story short, decided that she didn't want to be out here and went back to Washington, D.C., where we lived then at the time, and got married, and incidentally to an Air Force officer, and then went off on her own career with him and so forth. But I wanted to mention that I had 2 kids that lived here, other than my youngest daughter Beverly, who's here now, and went to school here, went to Caltech. And so we're multi-generational Pasadena.
Yeah.
And also my grandfather, my father's father, came here in the early 1920s, lived on Morton Street here in Pasadena. And actually, he might have been here before my father. My father might have followed him by a year or so to come to Pasadena. So we have quite a foothold, the Durham family does, in Pasadena. Oh, and about my two oldest children and my oldest sister, one anecdotal bit of information, and I can't exactly remember the year. They competed in the Family Feud TV show, if you remember that, where the family squared off and they answered questions and tried to work themselves up through elimination process. And they won the first and won the second and got beaten the third.
Oh, wow.
So they got a little bit of prize money. And the interesting thing about it is there's a photograph of my daughter, my son, my sister, and her 2 sons, my 2 nephews, of the family, representing our family on Family Feud on TV.
Oh, wow. Was that the Richard Dawson era of Family Feud?
Yes, it was. Yes, it was.
I remember it well.
Yes.
What drew your grandfather out to Pasadena?
They were both into the segregated South in Georgia and just looking for better opportunities and a better life. And he was a carpenter, and he came out here and continued that trade successfully, doing what carpenters do. And that's what drove my mother out here. That's what drove my father out here. Over time, my mother was in Oklahoma. She was in Cherokee territory, born there, and her father was born in Cherokee. Her mother was a term that they use in Oklahoma. My grandmother, my mother's mother, was a freedman, which means a former slave that were owned by the Cherokee Nation. And that's an interesting history. And I was doing some Ancestry.com research and found her, and she's on the registry and everything. My grandmother is out of the Cherokee Nation as a freedman. And I'm still pursuing that and getting more information. But my mother was born within the Cherokee Nation, even though it's not clear yet what her ethnicity was in regard to Native American, although I haven't got that far yet into the research, but I think there's a strong evidence that there's some Native American ancestry there involved on my mother's side. So they, she came out of that environment to California. So not only African Americans came to California, white Americans, the whole Oklahoma, what would you call it?
The Dust Bowl era, are we talking, or earlier than that? Or
We're talking, the Dust Bowl was in the, when? Help me with that.
I think late 20s, early 30s kind of timing.
Before then. Then. So there's a large migration of Southern folk from all ethnic groups that came to California. But I think the African American had the added burden of how they were treated in the South and segregation and so forth. And they were looking just for a better life.
Yeah. Do you know
Simple as that.
Do you know what Pasadena in particular might have had to offer, or was it just this is a nice place?
I think they came everywhere. I think they came to Southern California and also to the Bay Area. But my mother originally came to San Diego and then came up here. So it wasn't just Pasadena. But I think probably Pasadena offered the best opportunity for growth for them at the time. And it could have just as well been Riverside or Long Beach or anywhere else, but they chose Pasadena.
I'm fascinated by the freedmen and the Cherokee. I'd never heard about any of that. And
yes, the Cherokees had owned slaves.
Sort of leaves me a little bit
You've got a wonderful resource
speechless
here, Shada, to research that.
Yeah. Well, I think there may have to be another session.
Well, I'm not that much of an expert on it, only to know that it is documented, and there's a list, rolls, if you will, called the Dawes rolls, D-A-W-E-S, that's sanctioned by the Cherokee Nation and the federal government, that shows the people who are native Cherokee and freedmen, blood Cherokee and former slave Cherokee. And my grandmother is on the freedmen, on that roll, and I've gotten that far.
And her husband would have been, was he?
He was African American, but he was mixed race, and I'm still working through that right now. And it might have been Cherokee on his mixed race side. I'm not too certain. Interesting thing about my grandfather on my mother's side, my mother's father, he was also involved in the Return to Africa movement, and in 1909, where he and a group of African Americans chartered a ship and were on a campaign to encourage African Americans who were living in America to go back to Liberia. And they actually sailed, did an exploratory expedition to Liberia, stayed 6 months and came back, and the whole thing floundered and ultimately terminated. But there's a lot of documentation on that. And that did happen. My grandfather did sail to Liberia and come back, and he was part of that. And keeping in mind that he was involved in the Cherokee Nation side too. So it's a very, very colorful and very interesting history on my mother's side.
Grandparents, did you grow up knowing them?
Yes, I did. Not well. I only met my grandfather on my mother's side 3-4 times when he visited. So not well, but certainly did have contact. My grandfather on my father's side, who lived on Morton Street, the carpenter, saw frequently here in Pasadena, and had some wonderful times and conversations with him.
Did they have stories that you remember, family lore, or?
Well, the stories about the South, sharecropping in the South, and living in the South, and all the inequities of what was going on, and Jim Crow segregation in the South. Nothing new, pretty much what you would expect in regard to stories. But obviously they had enough, and they were in a position to do something about it, and they left.
Did the whole family leave?
Most of them did, because my father's sisters and brothers are out here too. So maybe not 100% or categorically, but most of them came to California, and all stayed in touch. They were in the so-called Pasadena, Los Angeles, in the Southern California area.
And what do you do now? What are your hobbies and interests? And
I'm retired right now. I mean, retired. When I left the Air Force, I took an appointment in the Clinton administration for 5 years, and I was an assistant secretary at the Department of Energy for 5 years, between 1993 and 1998. So that was after I retired from the Air Force, and then I retired from that job in '98, and traveled with my wife and whatever, and then she contracted cancer, and we went through that whole ordeal for 4 years, and then finally came here to Pasadena, or California, back home, which all my grown kids are here anyway, working. Incidentally, my oldest boy works for Disney, Walt Disney. He's an Imagineer, works in the Imagineering division, and they do such cool things as design theme parks and whatever, rides and that type of thing. They were well established here. So I came back and moved into a home in Carson and retired. And people ask the question, what are you doing now? And my pat answer is, nothing, but I'm doing it well. Myself and my lady friend, we go to concerts. We went out to, I think it was Long Beach State University about 6 months ago, and listened to a Glenn Miller, Tex Beneke Big Band Glenn Miller concert, just 6 months ago. So we try to stay in touch. We talked a little earlier before we started taping about the big band era, and Lionel Hampton was in a jazz concert at the Pasadena Civic Auditorium here in 1947, in the August of 1947, and recorded an all-time classic, Stardust, that is still, many argue, is the greatest jazz improvisation in modern times. And I was at that concert.
oh, wow.
And I've got that obviously in my collection. And so I started with music and listening to big bands way early, when I was a teenager, and also when I was in college. And the classic ballrooms here, Balboa, Palladium, the Avalon Ballroom, all of those, all the big names, Goodman, Kenton, all of them were playing the venues here, and I didn't miss any of them. It was really great. And so I'm a big band fan.
So do you still find a chance to go out and hear them then?
I do.
Yeah.
Yes, I do.
They're a little.
But they're like me, you know. They're getting a little long in the tooth, and many of them are fading away. And I remember just 6 months ago, there were just, I think, 4 members of that band that were in the original, and all the rest were newcomers,
Yeah.
which is understandable.
Fit that out, but
We talked earlier about the Air Force Band, the Glenn Miller Band, and when I was the commander at Andrews, they were under my command, and because of that opportunity, they performed it. They were sought after all over because of their legacy. Obviously, they always performed in the khaki, pinks, and green uniforms of World War II, and they performed at Carnegie Hall, a memorable concert. And you can imagine how many original Glenn Miller fans were at that. They filled the place. And that was in 1982, perhaps 83. And the wife and I went up to that concert and watched them play, and just brought back memories, because when I grew up listening to music, it was nothing but big band, all big band during the 40s, late 30s and 40s, and that's when I was a teenager.
Did you dance?
You mean professionally? Or,
Well, did you?
No. I could get out there and do a step or two, but I wasn't known as being a great dancer.
But you enjoyed the music, and
I love music, and I very much love the big band era. And incidentally, I'm very pleased to see that the modern generation likes them too. Current.
it's worthwhile. It's worthwhile stuff.
I think so. I think so. Of course, I have a bias, but I think so.
What is your goal in agreeing to do this? Did you have a particular story you wanted to tell, or a particular idea you wanted to convey?
Not really. I just wanted to preserve my family heritage and history, and I thought a good place and safe place to do it would be not only the library, but the museum, Pasadena Museum of History. And I just wanted to get it documented and put away somewhere that maybe 50, 100 years from now, if someone was interested, it would be there and not lost.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the primary motivation. And second to that, I think that the whole era of black history in Pasadena is worth chronicling, and I think it should be preserved, and I think that people should look back and review it. And recognize what went on here in this city, and what the problems were, and what the solutions were, and what the successes were that happened here in regard to the black community. So that's another aspect of it. And as I understand it, that's part of your interest in why you're doing this, and that's good that you're going to take this to the students and schools. So there's those two things, to put it into history where I think it has a fair chance of being preserved and staying, and also making it available to the community. We've had a rich history, a rich heritage, my family, and I've had a very fortunate career, and I think we've been blessed, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to share it.
Well, then I'm going to say thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome.
And for the talk. I've enjoyed it, and thank you.